So hello everyone, and thank you for those that are live streaming. My name is Marjorie Sims, and I am honored to be the Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, and it is a pleasure to be moderating this session, Two Open Windows, Understanding Brain Science, and it informs and ignites opportunities. And further, I am even more honored to be sitting here with two Ascend Fellows, Dr. Sarah Wadamura from the University of Denver, and also Dr. Matt Beal. And then also they are being joined by, and I'm actually going to read his title because the other two panelists, you can also read their titles in your program book. But Randall's title came a little bit late, but we really wanted to be able to acknowledge him. And so Randall Baylor, who is a family service coordinator with Children's National Health System, a member of the Early Childhood Innovation Network, Healthy Steps, and Child Health Advocacy Institute. Now, what a title that is. And he also is a native Washingtonian.
Absolutely.
And a parent.
Yes.
So we are pleased to also have a parent advocate on this panel. But we're going to start off by hearing from Dr. Sarah Wadamura, who, again, as I said, she's an Ascend Fellow and has been working over the last several years in her capacity as an associate professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Denver, really looking at the brain science, particularly around how new parents' brains change. And then we're going to hear from Matt and Randall, hear their perspective on the work that they're doing in the Washington, D.C. community, how this research informs their work, and then also some insights from the work that they're doing at the community level. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Wadamura so she can walk us through a presentation that I promise you will be amazing brain candy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to come down here because we're going to do some science. We're going to do it fast, so I'm going to move around so we can stay focused. I am going to give you a little tour of some publicly available government data and some pretty brain pictures that is going to tell you exactly the same thing that the parent panel told you before, which is that inequities are severe. We have to do something better than what we're doing now. It matters for the way brains and bodies grow and the way that we think about our future. So I'm going to press the big white button, Anne, and hopefully that will get us where we need to go here. I wanted to just very quickly acknowledge my amazing colleagues. I am actually not a brain imager. That work is Pil-Young Kim's, who's in the middle of this graph. And I also want to acknowledge all the contributors to science across the country and the globe, which includes a lot of people whose names never get mentioned, who do a great deal of the work. What we're going to talk about are two central ideas here. What do we know about the science of inequity? It turns out we know a great deal. And then what would happen if we tried to flip the frame a little bit from talking exclusively about how bad things break brains, break bodies, don't get built properly, to thinking about how would we think about building a biology of resilience? What does it look like to measure that, to talk about that, to promote that, in contrast to just comparing adversity-exposed individuals to non-adversity-exposed individuals, which I think does not get you to resilience. So we're going to start with the science of inequity. This is the part where my undergraduate students get really bummed out about the world, and then I hand over to them the great task of trying to fix what we have done wrong. So the science of inequity is, we have decades of research really making it clear that we do not do well as humans. We don't grow well. We don't thrive when we experience inequity. So this isn't just for people who have less. It's actually bad for all of us when we live in situations where there's extreme forms of inequity across individuals. So to the top sort of left, the pink graph, what that's showing you is that the cost to health of economic inequity has been getting bigger across time. So the difference between the bars you can see is getting more spread. So it costs our health more to experience inequity. And the little graph on the bottom you've probably seen before is the degree of rising inequity that we're experiencing in our country, right? So the difference in income across individuals. So just to make that absolutely clear, at the same time that the cost of the inequity is getting worse, the size of the inequity is getting bigger, okay? We also know that in the United States, we have really extreme levels of inequity, and that positions us in a bad place relative to the globe with respect to the cost for health. So if you look across nations, you can plot the degree of inequity and the cost to health in a pretty linear fashion, and we are not at the part of the graph where we want to be, right? We have very significant social and health problems that are linked to the inequities that we have. We also are not going in the right direction. So for most of our lives, we've watched the average life expectancy that a newborn can look forward to going up. That has not been true in the last 2 years, okay? Newborns now have a shorter life expectancy than they did a few years ago. We are 43rd in the world in terms of life expectancy. So that is not reflective of the opportunities that we have. We also know some about how we're getting there. So the two biggest contributors to the drop in life expectancy are death by suicide and drug overdose. We have, it depends where you are in the country. Some of you know this sort of pressingly from your day-to-day experience. These problems are devastating, individuals, families, communities. It's starting to have a really enormous impact across the whole country. These problems can really no longer be avoided, and we can get to the root of these issues, I think, by looking at what we already know, the research that's already been done. I do want to point out, though, that it is not always what you might assume. So the longest living individuals in our country are Latinas. Perhaps we might look to our Latina community for some opportunities. What is making you healthier? What is contributing to the resilience that you're having? And what is causing this enormous inequity between our longest living individuals and our shortest living individuals? And what are the things that we are all doing that are contributing to that? Health gradients begin very early in life. They probably begin in the womb, but they certainly begin in the first 3 years. So we see differences in the health of infants based on their family's economic position, okay? We also know that early adversity, so the types of adversities that our parent panel was describing for you, have lifelong consequences. They affect almost every chronic disease, the top 10 leading causes of death, including death by suicide and drug overdose. So our children who are experiencing these significant adversities in childhood, they are cutting short their life expectancy in all of these significant chronic diseases, okay? Heart disease, diabetes, infectious illness. And we are seeing that at alarmingly elevated rates. The total cost of that, the total cost of these early adversities when they are severe, so 4 or more, 6 or more, is 20-year lifespan reduction, okay? This is national data. This is publicly available. You can Google it. Lots of people contributed to these numbers, and lots of people have lived this reality. So we have some ideas about how we might have gotten here. And I often come to this type of forum and give you a little tutorial on brain science. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do that now that we've taken this little walk and we've thought about inequity, right? We think we have some explanations for how we're getting there, and I think there's some holes in the logic that we really need to attend to. So this particular paper, an important result, got some good press. The focus of this is on the 3 lines at the 3-year age point, so 36 months. And what you can see is by 36 months of age, infants have different size brains, depending on the economic resources their family has. But I would like to point out that that's not true at the front end, right? And we know a lot about what to do in the first 3 months, first 3 years of life to promote brain development, right? The basos have stepped out, but lots of people are working on these issues. Oh, you know, you're here. You're still here. I thought you were gone, but it must have been the break. Right? So we know a lot about what to do in the first 3 months. This is not a mystery, right? This is not secret science. To help promote brain development in those first few years of life. This is a different study, big study, really interesting results where they looked at the connection between family income and cortical surface, so that's the foldy part of the brain, how much cortical surface do you have, between 3 years of age and 20 years of age. And this paper got a lot of press, was very important, talked about a lot in terms of what we call sort of a linear increase in income and brain development. But the reason I picked this particular figure, I think there's something really interesting about it, which is that you see actually most of the action is right at the front. Okay, so $50,000. It doesn't look like actually you have a supersized brain if you, right, are way out here at 300,000. It looks like getting everybody to $50,000 might make a big difference, right? So I'm interested in these targets we can identify. What are we talking about? What does it take here, reading, singing, talking to babies, communities who give parents enough time to do these things amidst all their other responsibilities so that we can build a brain that has all the potential that it was meant to have. So we also know that families are experiencing adversity together, right? It's not happening to a baby, it's happening to a family. And that matters for the family's well-being. In fact, you maybe have all experienced this personally. When somebody experiences adversity in childhood and again in adulthood, their health outcomes are worse than would be expected just by adding those things up. So we call that an interaction. So what you can see here is the orange line. If it was just additive, it would be right here, right? But the cardiovascular disease outcomes are much worse when you experience both of those adversities. That particular graph is from a study with 30,000 people in a Scandinavian country where they have very good data, and that's a cardiovascular outcome. So this is, nice, solid science. We also know that early adversity coupled with adversity in adolescence matters for health. There's been a long-standing study in Minnesota that's looked at this. And we see the health consequences by age 32, which is much earlier than we typically catch them. So when you're talking about chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, that kind of thing, you start to see it in 50, 60. This is at 32. 32-year-olds on average pretty healthy. So starting to think about what does that mean when we talk so much about early life? It means we also have to care about what happens when people hit the next sensitive period, which is adolescence. So the story we tell, the story that has been told, is that adverse childhood experiences disrupt neural development that results in social, cognitive, and emotional impairment. That leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which leads to disease and untimely death. I think that pathway is important, and I don't think it's exclusive. So there are lots of examples of individuals who do not adopt health risk behaviors, right? Aren't smoking, having risky sex, using illicit substances, who still have pretty significant consequences on their health from their early adversity. So we need to think about how that's happening. Otherwise, we would just focus all our attention on smoking cessation, right? That would solve it. So I also think this question of disrupted neurodevelopment needs to be re-examined. What is the child doing? How are they building their brain when they're being told that they're in a high threat and low resource environment, right? Are they doing something that makes sense? And if they're doing something that makes sense, building a brain that makes sense for the environment they're in versus having something that's broken, that gives us a different framework to work with in terms of thinking about solutions. So as I've been telling you, we have this deep, convincing body of science that adversity is bad for you. It's bad for your health. It shortens your life. We know a lot about how it happens. What we don't know enough about is how to promote resilience, how to promote opportunity, especially when the adversity has already occurred, right? So one of the things that many people don't like about the ACEs study, I've had parents even say to me, it's like a scarlet letter. You know, you take my ACE score, and what am I going to do with that? I can't erase that. What do we do when the adversity has already occurred to promote resilience? And who should we ask that question of? The people who have experienced it, right? Who are thriving, who need different things maybe than what we might dream up, and could give us some very targeted guidance. But I don't think that we can get there unless we get rid of our implicit assumption of irrationality. So we behave in many of our programs and policies as if people are behaving self-destructively and irrationally, and that if we just educated them around that, they would stop doing those things. I think they're behaving exquisitely rationally, right? If you have experienced high threat and low resource environment, you make different decisions than somebody who's experienced a leisurely high resource environment. That's a well-built brain. It's an adapted brain. If you want that brain to do something different, you probably have to change the value proposition. So a concrete example of that is you've probably heard of the marshmallow task, most people. Okay, so the marshmallow task, just so we're all on the same page, you take a small child, you put them in a room, some nice young woman typically says, you can eat this marshmallow, but if you wait until I come back, you can have 2. And then she goes out, right? So a child who has had adults who are able to keep their promises, right? Who don't get called into work unexpectedly, who has never been hungry, right? Mellow, right? The kid who has experienced adults who aren't always able to keep their promises, has had insecurity around food and other resources. What fool in that circumstance doesn't eat the marshmallow, right? Is that irrational? It's not irrational, right? It's not what we want, because delay of gratification is so important to get all the way through school, to work hard for that job, to work through every type of adversity. That takes a lot of delay of gratification, which we of course want to support, okay? But do we fix this problem by training delay of gratification, or do we fix this problem by showing the child that adults can be trusted, showing the child that resources can be stable, right? That they can wait, they can afford to wait for the second marshmallow. That's true for all the other examples on there, which I obviously don't have time to go through, but I'm happy to do that at another point. So I think if we want to change the way participants respond to the programming that we offer, first of all, we should let them design the programming. And secondly, we should make sure that we're not assuming irrational behavior and messaging that over and over, right? You're hurting yourself, you're being self-destructive, you're not behaving rationally, you need to change those behaviors, versus I would probably do the exact same thing in your situation. Let's think about changing the situation, okay? All right, so what happens if we change the frame and start thinking about a biology of resilience? What does it look like to have resilience built into your body the way that adversity can be? How do we measure that? What would that look like? I think there are a lot of people, probably in this room and definitely in this city, who we could learn so much from, right? What do your epigenetics look like? What is your, what do your stress systems look like? How do you handle it when you hit a bump in the road? And how can we promote those same biological and therefore behavioral responses in others so that we can help you be more successful? And I think one really key part of that is thinking about taking advantage of sensitive periods across the lifespan. So this, I think, is what I was actually supposed to talk about today. So now I'm on track. We know that we change and develop across our whole lives, right? If you don't believe me, then just go somewhere where there are elderly individuals on their smartphones, okay? We also know it from the reverse. We know that interventions matter even at the end of life, because if we don't do them, intervention matters until the day you die. Positive environments matter until the day you die. But there are particular times in life where individuals are so rapidly growing their brains and bodies, changing, rewiring, reworking how things are connected, that if we jump in at those points and support change, we can have more effective outcomes. And so there are at least 3 time periods in the lifespan where this is true. I think we will continue to learn of others. Early life, which we've done a great job of selling, so yay us. Early life, prenatal, first 3 years, first 1,000 days, however you want to slice and dice that. Adolescence, which is a long period, 8 to 25, right, is the current definition of adolescence. That doesn't mean that an individual is in adolescence between 8 to 25, in case you're wondering. It just means that you could be. Some people start early, and some people finish up a little later. But we have really phenomenal data, right, that brains are working on really important things during that time period. They're working on emotion regulation, problem solving, self-regulation. Those are critical adult life skills that we need people to have. And of course, we probably all know or could think of famous individuals who lack those characteristics. So to understand resilience, which is better than expected outcomes given an assessment of risk, that's the technical definition, we need to look at not just say, oh boy, people who experienced a lot of adversity in life, 5 or more ACEs, 6 in 10 of those people are going to have depression as compared to 2 in 10 of the general population. We could do that. It's important to do that. But we could also say, what else happened for those 4 people who didn't have that particular outcome? Okay, do they have other outcomes? And that's probably part of the story. Did they have other protective factors? Right? Did they have yes, they had these adversities, but maybe there was a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, somebody who really believed in them, right? This is not at all beyond our capability to measure. We just have to think about asking the right questions. And as somebody who was trained as an adversity researcher, we were literally not trained to ask these questions. We look for the bad stuff, right? We forget to ask about what made this possible for you, right? What made this work? We also know that families move, families change, and we tend to forget this. We tend to focus on statistics and act as if they're static, and that's not correct. So you've probably heard, everybody's heard, we lost the war on poverty, right? Everybody's heard that, okay. And we say that because the poverty rate has remained stable for the past 50 years. Okay, that's not good. I'm totally on board, that's not good. That does not mean, however, that the same people have been poor. That's not the same thing, okay? So that doesn't mean that nobody's life has changed, that no programs have worked. They're just different facts. And so we wanted to look at that question directly. So we looked at data from 4 big national data sets, combined them together, people in studies for different reasons, nothing about this particular question. And we just asked the question of that data, do people move between when they're in the first year of life with a new child and the 3rd year of life with a new child? So what we found, first of all, is that people across the country sort of grouped into 3 really interesting, distinct profiles. One was a low-risk group. You might expect that, higher maternal education, low poverty at that moment when their child was in the first year of life. And they both were experiencing poverty, lower maternal education, using TANF, that kind of thing. But what they differed on was instability. So one of the groups was experiencing food insecurity, housing instability, no savings. And the other group had those protections in place, maybe because they were utilizing housing services, right? Maybe because they had close family, close supports. We don't know the reasons, but they differed on that instability piece, and we know how important instability is in terms of health. So then when we look at the same families, when the kid was age 3, we now have 90% of families in this lower risk category. 99% of the people who were low risk at time 1, which is great, we didn't lose anyone, almost no one. And now 87% of the families who were in that high risk but low instability group are now in the low risk group, okay? What has changed? They're no longer living in poverty. Mom's education has gone up. What has made that possible? Probably a lot of the programming that is available, probably a lot of the parents thinking about having a different life for their kids, right? Having that core motivation of having a baby and thinking, this isn't gonna work. We have to do something different than this current reality. And then 56%, so quite a few still moved up, but 56% of folks in the high instability group are still stuck. Okay, so that also tells us a little bit about where to focus. And we have increasing rates of income instability in the country as we move away from an employer-centered economic model to one that is contractor-driven. Okay, so the basic idea that we've been talking about, that Ascend works on, is that we want to improve outcomes for a child at the first and most important sensitive period of life. We know that their family is their most important social, educational, and emotional environment. And so we also have to think about mom and dad, right? And so what are we gonna do to support not only those adults as the target of change, which one of the parents, Ren, I think you said, just telling me do this because of my kid versus what do you want? What do you want the outcome to be? How do we move past that, treating the parents in this case simply as an agent of change to make a different life for their kids versus a changeable agent, somebody who themselves can have a different reality, can have a different life, and what that means for moving the family forward. So a science of projection tries to reduce adversity wherever it can and build buffering support of parents so that they can be these incredible resources. And I use the term parents quite broadly. So we know we can turn back the clock. You can reduce some of the costs of adversity on your own health. You can do that by exercise, by meditation, likely by social connections, by giving back, the types of things we heard our parents talking about, them most wanting to do. So it's not a scarlet letter. It isn't deterministic. It isn't forever. But if we do nothing, it will be. So you can regrow your telomeres. There's a lot of people working on epigenetics and what might be pharmacologic or other targets to try to change the way genes are expressed. So a lot of action in those fronts in the next 10 years, I would expect. So parenting, it turns out, also changes your brain. Most people, there's people laughing. Most people, when you say that parenting has changed your brain, we generally don't mean a positive thing, right? Which is actually really unfortunate because the changes that happen to your brain when you become a new parent are all growth, okay? There's a recent review of all the papers that have been published, and it is all growth, okay? So, okay, you might not be so good at remembering where you put your glasses, right? But your priorities have changed. That doesn't mean your brain isn't working, right? Your priorities have changed. Your priorities are now focused on this tiny person. And these massive, really massive functional and structural changes that happen to the brain do really important things. They change the way you handle stress. Specifically, you're less responsive to stress directed at yourself and more responsive to stress directed at your child. Okay, mama bear thing. Promotes positive emotions and bonding, increases parental motivation, and promotes caregiving behavior. I'm just highlighting my amazing colleague, Pil-Young Kim, again, whose research this is. We know where in the brain this happens, and it happens in some really interesting places. So it happens in the reward circuit, which is the part of your brain that helps you approach things that are of value to you, like food and other humans. And it happens really dramatically in this area so that you can now be super rewarded by your own baby. You might be wondering why there's a rat up there. There's a rat up there because rats love cocaine. That is actually the reason the rat is up there. Rats love cocaine. They will press a lever to get cocaine instead of eat or drink. So they really, really have a problem with it. If you take a new, I'm getting to the point, I promise. If you take a new mom rat and put her in a cage where she can press a lever to get cocaine or press it to hear her pup cry, she will press it to hear her pup cry, okay? So a system that can be completely co-opted by a drug of abuse is that sensitive to the infant signal. And that's how we have the same change, same areas of the brain, humans have the same area of the brain, and we see the same changes that have been documented in animal models, where we become very oriented toward this infant signal, which is how you get up like 4, 5, 6, 8 times in the night. So we see structural growth in new mothers and new fathers. The amount of growth is substantial and connected to how much people say their baby is beautiful, perfect. More activity is also connected to pictures of your own baby versus just a baby. So you don't just like babies, you like this baby. We see changes in the social information circuit, which is the part of the brain that helps you detect social signals. So if you can just picture yourself peering at the infant and trying to think what on earth it wants, right? Your brain is working to figure out what on earth does that baby want. That slight little turn maybe means this, mapping the social signals to activity in the brain. And then parenting is nothing if not a giant emotion regulation task, right? You have to be motivated to care for your child's distress and control your own feelings so that you can parent effectively. We see massive changes in the brains of new mothers and new fathers in the emotion regulation circuit. Okay, new mothers and new fathers. It's also recent evidence shown to be true for non-biologic parents. Okay, so it's the act of caregiving that does the heavy lifting here. It matters that you have those activations in your brain. You are a more sensitive parent the more you have that type of activity to that baby. And we have some evidence that that link is there. And we also have some very clear idea that parents make this amazing difference in the outcomes that kids experience. So this is some data from my lab where we stressed babies in the presence of their caregivers. The ones who were there with parents who were that sensitive that I just showed you in the previous, right? So high maternal sensitivity, sensitive, not detached, not on their phone. Those babies did not respond to our series of frankly nasty stressors. That's the blue line. They had mom or dad there and they were fine. The orange line are the kids who faced those tasks with a parent who was on their phone, less sensitive, unengaged, and they responded physiologically to each one of those challenges on their own. Again, that's adaptive, right? They're using their physiology to get through it, but it isn't what we hope for, right? It isn't what connects us to this long, leisurely developmental pathway. So we know that neural associations are dampened when parents experience significant adversity and stress. It is harder to get your brain to respond to this new baby in the way that you need when you've had substance use disorder, depression, and not good models of caregiving yourself. So that is something very, very concerning, right? Because not only are you in difficult circumstances, but you're not getting the same support from your brain that you might otherwise get. So people naturally asked, can we do something about that? If we get in there right away when a new baby is born and provide an intervention support, can we see changes in brain activation? And this is the first paper to show that effect. This is an intervention out of Michigan called Mom Power. I think the same results would be found for other effective interventions, but they literally showed changes in neural responsivity to infants as a response to this intervention that improved the relationship between the baby and the parent. So takeaways, inequities are severe and they matter a lot, but that's an average. People change, brains change. Inequity is not inevitability. Adaptations are rational. People are behaving in ways that make sense for the life that they've experienced. And if we want to help people behave differently, then we have to think about helping them change the value proposition. Get in a situation where you get rewarded for delay, where you get supported when you try to do something difficult. We've had parents tell us, who's the person in your life you don't tell that you're going back to school, right? There's people, you're just gonna do it, and then once you get some traction, maybe you'll tell that aunt or that mom that you're doing that. What does it look like to change your environment so that you can be successful? Resilience can be understood. We have the tools to do this biologically, behaviorally, experientially. We don't lack the tools to do this, but we have to turn our attention to it. We have to stop just comparing people who have experienced adversity to those who have not in the misguided attempt to think that that's going to give us the right solutions. And as we are all here at Ascend, supporting children and the adults in their lives together can be transformative for those individuals and multiplicative, having better than additive, better than expected outcomes. Thank you to the funders and some of the many people who contributed. You're up.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Presentation, so thank you. I'd now like to bring in Randall and Matt into the conversation. So again, they're working, in the community with parents, with children, and their work has been well recognized, here in the region and across the country. So what I'd like for you to do is share the specifics of your work and then some reflections on Sarah's presentation and insights that you may take forward and implement in your work.
Sure. Want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sarah's wonderful talk, and really, really so much to think about. I also just want to take a moment to return to thanking the parents from the previous panel.
Yay.
Because I thought the insight that you all shared was really profound and really got me thinking. And I'm sitting here thinking, listening to Sarah's talk, Daniel, right, about the ways that your brain may have changed when you became a parent, and also about this idea of developmental windows, and the way that your dad's brain had been changing as he's become an active grandparent and really co-raising your kid with you. This is very real, live stuff that Sarah's teaching us about, and I think it's so deeply relevant. So we're sitting in DC, and we're in this beautiful space, and everyone who gives these kind of remarks in DC says the following: a few short miles from where we're sitting right now, there is massive inequity and challenges that families are facing. What sometimes people leave out of that is the semicolon. We're also a few short miles from massive human talent, creativity, and deployment of limited resources to do great things on behalf of kids and families. I'll be the second person today to acknowledge Joe Jones, who I've started to use a phrase that I learned from him, which is that in the world many of us live in, the family is the unit of intervention, which is something I've just thought about again and again since I've heard you say that, Joe. And also just thinking about my colleague Wendy Ellis, who you'll hear from tomorrow, and how she thinks about and talks about ACEs as not just adverse childhood experiences, but also adverse community environments, and the ways in which the environments in which families are living and raising their families are so impactful. It also seems to me that one of the things that's left out of ACEs conversations is that ACEs are not just things that happen to kids, they're things that are happening to families. Mm-hmm. And so many things that we count as ACEs are actually also really deeply noxious and traumatic and difficult for family members. And so we have to think about the ways that we're going to respond from this standpoint of families or the unit of intervention. So one of the things that I get to work on with Randall, and I'll let him tell you more about it, is a network that we created in DC, which is called the Early Childhood Innovation Network. And the idea is to take the four words of our title very much to heart: early childhood, so we're really focused on conception to age 5. It's an innovation network, so we're looking for innovative strategies from anywhere that people are doing good things, and then figuring out how to deploy implementation science to make that work with and for families that we hope to partner with in DC. And then it's a network, meaning that we're not as clinicians, as researchers, as team leaders like Randall, riding into neighborhoods from Georgetown or from Children's National on our white horses saying, we've got something here, this great new program for you. We're rather saying, how can we humbly, quietly, effectively, and for the long term partner with organizations, some of whom are here today, that are already doing outstanding work with kids and families, and try to use this standpoint of innovation to really ratchet things up to a next level of impact. A few brief examples of things we're doing are looking at mindfulness. Many people are excited about mindfulness these days as intervention. We're particularly interested in mindfulness for parents and for educators as a strategy that might promote brain change, that might promote increased capacity for empathy, increased capacity for compassion, including, most importantly, self-compassion, increased capacity to suspend judgment, and to respond sensitively to challenges in one's life as a parent, as well as an educator. I was struck by Ms. Bell, who was on the panel before, also her pointing out how much being a Head Start educator was part of her journey, and how true that is of so many early childhood educators, that they've had experiences of adversity in their own lives and are parenting and are educating youngest kids, what a great place of leverage that is to support those individuals in that line of really, really important work. So mindfulness is one strategy that we're pursuing with a lot of enthusiasm. Another is thinking about pediatric primary care, and how to use a visit the families make to their pediatricians as an opportunity to be with families during the journey of raising kids, to understand the experiences of families, and to identify as early as possible what are the barriers and obstacles that they're encountering, and to use that time right now, not a referral, not sending somebody across town, not 3 buses to go see this person, but how do we harness and build resources right here in pediatric clinics so that families can act now. And that's part of what Randall's work is so important in leading. Perfect time for me to turn over to you and give us some color there.
Okay, so as Matt mentioned, we are part of the Early Childhood Innovation Network. The work that I'm so deeply involved in the primary care setting is spearheaded under Healthy Steps, which is a national model. The focus of it is to address a lot of the things that we're speaking of here, drastically limiting, reducing, potentially eliminating adverse childhood experiences, as well as having a series of different screenings, including the ACEs, but as well as the ASQ, Edinburgh, other things like that, to determine the behavioral health status of the parent as well as the child. Some of the things that we found very, very sort of interesting in my work is that not only are mothers subjected to the postpartum depressions and some of the pre and post birth labors, the fathers can actually experience a lot of these symptoms as well, a lot of these feelings as well. As mentioned in the last panel, we're working rather much more sort of say tedious to get fathers drawn back into the picture. I feel that from a societal standpoint, there's not enough inclusion for the father just naturally. So the mothers are typically dependent to, make the appointments, to take the child to the appointment, to deal with some of the other, some medical concerns and things that are not specifically, they're not specifically to the mother or the father, but the mother ends up or is looked at as the traditional person to handle those things. Here within the Healthy Steps setting, we're located within Anacostia and within the ARC, which are both located in Ward 8. We're going to be expanding legislation in terms of providing it 2 different wards, but currently those are the wards. Ward 8 is the current ward that we're operating in, which is one of the most impoverished wards in the DC, one of the most wards where, so to say, the equality and the equity is scarce and not really city reflective in terms of opportunities, resources, and things of that nature. One of the main things that I'm working on with families is that working with families to prevent the fires. We've seen and chased enough fires. We know what fire does. We know how damaging fire is. We know how hot it is. We know the outcomes of what a large flame can do. But sometimes if we just see a glimpse of smoke, we know that there's the potential that fire can come there. So if we're able to address some of these concerns on the front end through screenings, through working with primary care physicians, through working with community leaders and other citywide service providers to identify not only one area that we can provide support in, but sort of say household support. So to address some of the socio-economical factors that we're dealing with within the homes, to reduce some of the stresses associated with not having or not knowing about resources. One of the largest things that I do with my position is resource navigation. That comes about through relationship building, cross-sector navigation, but it's something that does not, I feel, have enough enough focus on it from a citywide perspective to understand the importance of what agencies and governments can do if they work more collaboratively versus, even if it's broken down from department. Through the work that we're doing with the resource navigation, we're able to get parents and children access to services, opportunities, and resources at a much higher rate, which in the end reduces a lot of the adverse experiences within the household. My model that I like to look at is that you have to be able to inherit the concern of the family. If you're not able to inherit the concern of the family, then maybe you're not, so to say, best equipped to know what is needed to properly support a family. A lot of what we're seeing in DC really results down to lack of informational awareness, inability to be able to navigate a resource from A to Z, and we're helping a lot more families do that. And when you're looking for assistance, or when you're looking for work or looking for support, I think a lot of us have heard the term the gatekeeper. When you come across the gatekeeper, this is a person that you're trying to get through to or trying to get some information from. And more often than not, when we come across these gatekeepers, they're not really benefiting what it is that we're trying to get to the next level. They're more of a deterrent. They may be a person that doesn't have the time. They don't have the patience. They don't possess the skill load. They may just be having a bad day. It's a lot that can go into it when you're looking to get some help, and when you're looking to get help and support, you really need it. And some people come in terms of, with heightened sense of urgencies to needing help. There's the need has already exceeded itself. The void is much larger than what it was before, and now one stressor has caused many stressors now, which in terms just is a trickle-down effect within the whole household. Through the work that we're doing and connecting with citywide leadership, governments, things of that nature, we're able to, as I mentioned, directly reduce those areas, working with the families that we're servicing and help them to live better lives, not only from a health standpoint, but just from a overall household standpoint.
Right.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So Randall, you mentioned that you work out of the ARC, right?
Anacostia.
And Anacostia, but
Yes.
the ARC,
Yes.
is that where you work? So I'm not certain how many of you are familiar with the ARC in Anacostia, but could you paint a picture of this? Because this truly is a state-of-the-art kind of
Absolutely.
community resource.
Absolutely.
And then how many families are served there? And then what types of services do you help them navigate or have a resource?
I'm located mainly out of Anacostia. I do work closely with the ARC, though. The ARC is our newer facility. It's recently been completely brand new, built from the ground up. I think they opened maybe officially about a month or two back. But out of the Anacostia office, we're currently servicing anywhere between, I believe, 200 to 300 patients per day. So that's a day-to-day thing. That ages. I mean, of course, that ranges from 0 to 18. Healthy Steps specifically targets on children between the ages of 0 to 3 with the ability to provide support to children 0 to 5. What we're helping them navigate is everything from specialty medical appointments. I've also worked in terms of taking on some new responsibilities that weren't there before. Coming into a pilot program, one of the beauties of it was that it really was a model, but we had to make it our own. So we had to customize it to the DC area. Being that so, I was able to work closely with leadership as well as other departments to identify ways that we can improve the systematics in terms of the way we operate. So we're doing autism intakes. We're doing all early intervention referrals. That is for DC, Maryland, and some of Virginia. Also for some families that we're servicing in Baltimore occasionally. We are doing full family support. So, of course, anything in regards to behavioral health for both the parent and the child. We're doing system navigation from anything from insurance to TANF to child care vouchers to transportation assistance to household supplies and needs, diapers, things of that nature. We do our own. We have a diaper bank partnership, so we're providing a multitude of services and supports, and it can vary. If a family comes in and it's something that we haven't navigated before, then we'll definitely take the time to learn it and go back and figure out how that we can support the family.
Great. And are you finding that fathers are asking for different services than moms are?
What I've seen here recently is that fathers are looking for different variations of support. They could be, anything from fatherhood initiatives or fatherhood work groups. We were just mentioning or had a conversation here recently at a testimony with with Chairman Gray rather, and he spoke about the same thing about fathers not really getting enough attention or enough focus or enough credit really. Fathers are really no different from the moms. They want to be involved. What we're seeing is that what we hear recently, what we're seeing more of is that fathers that are coming more into custodial roles, some that don't have any prior parenting skills or knowledge. And I think for me, I think that when we're talking about parenting, it doesn't really. It boils down to you being a parent, but it boils down to your reflection of what a parent was to you. Right. So if you haven't had the opportunity to get a good example of what a parent is, then it can be difficult for you going into parenthood and being a parent to your child. So we're seeing fathers, when they come in and don't have those skills, they say, hey, I don't know if I should be leaving the baby like this, or is this something I should be doing, or he's crying too much and I gave him everything that he needs, So they're wanting to know more. They're wanting to learn more to be able to engage more and act better with their children.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a second, but Matt, do you have children?
I do.
Okay, I'm going to ask all of you a personal question, including you, Sarah, because I've always wondered about this.
Great.
So,
This wasn't in the preview.
I know it wasn't.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just like slipping this in. This is a personal question. So, based on what you learned about the changes in new parents' brain, what did you think? And Sarah, as the person that's kind of close to this, when you had your children, what was going through your mind having all of this knowledge? So I'm going to start with Matt first. So when you heard that your brain was changing, I know you probably felt it, but the research behind it, how did that impact you? What do you think?
I think a lot of what Sarah talked about reminds, and I reflect on this in my own life as well, was I think it was in the last presidential administration where his chief of staff at one point said, never let a good crisis go to waste. That becoming a parent is a crisis. I mean, it is a full body, full soul crisis that crosses generations. You reflect on your own identity in fundamental ways. I will acknowledge that I was spared from 99% of the biological crisis that was involved with becoming a parent, but there was a tiny bit. And so I think that everything that we're thinking about is this balance between vulnerability and opportunity, and how closely those things travel together. So the way that I thought about it is in my own life was, and this is probably reflective of personality. It's just like, what an amazing chance to try to get some things right, and also knowing that you don't, like, the goal is not perfect. The goal is kind of good enough, and there's daily opportunities for repair, and I think that there's probably a neurological correlate to repair, and to the tiny little ruptures and repairs that happen between infants and parents are happening all the time. And that's just such an awesome opportunity for growth.
Great, thank you. Randall.
I think I pretty much, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that I maybe was feeling some postpartum depressions, just not knowing, not knowing, with my first child, if I was going to get it right, how was it going to work? What would I need? Also knowing that a child is not temporary, so the child is here now. So we got a whole life ahead of us. So I think for me it was more of looking to get prepared, but also wanting to know what I would need to have Timmy to be prepared. And for that took me to do some reflection, some self-reflection. I think that I gauged my parenting on what I had as a mother or father. For me, my mother and father weren't in the picture, so I was raised by my grandmother. So I never had an example of a father. And then, so it's difficult for me to think or imagine how it is that I would be a father, but all I know is that I just wanted to give my child everything that I didn't have in terms of love, in terms of attention, in terms of being with them, not from a materialistic standpoint, but just being able to reverse, as Matt said, some of the negative experiences that I had in terms of my reflections of what a father is, and being able to instill them back into my child from a positive standpoint.
Thank you, thank you. And Sarah?
Well, when I had my first child, I didn't know much. So the parenting brain research, the first paper was published in 2011. And it took a little while to get enough of it together that we sort of knew what we were talking about. I think for me, I remember when my daughter was an infant, sort of putting my hands up in the air in the middle of the night going, I have all this useless knowledge. And having to really just come to terms with the fact that parenting is not an intellectual exercise, right? It's not my category, And just coming to terms with this is a deeply personal, physical, relational activity, right? I need my friends. I need to talk to other parents. I need to the lived experience of it to do the best job at it. So that was one thing that I think was a little hard for me to reconcile. And then once I did was sort of freeing, right? Like the way to do this is the way it feels right, the way that I see somebody at the park. What a great way to solve that problem. I don't need a book. Right? And then the other thing, which I mentioned and is very recent, I'm not biologically related to either of my children. And I wondered all these years, did my brain change? I think it did. I feel like it did in all these ways. So there's just recently some evidence to suggest that not only are there not differences between mothers and fathers, but when parents are involved as caregivers, there's not differences between biological and non-biologic parents.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm opening up to the audience, and I have a question right over here on the end. And then I'll come to you, Joe, and then we'll go in the back. If you don't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
I'm Jessica Seinfeld on behalf of the Good Plus Foundation, collaborating on father absence with many, many people in this room. The King, Joe Jones, being one of them.
King.
And Randall, I want to thank you for bringing up fatherhood. And really my question, though, is, and each of you, Matt, all of you have raised such incredible points for all of us. But I'm wondering, Sarah, if your research about mom sensitivity and the reward center in the brain, and you talked a lot about mothers, if there is research and how fathers are measured in the same way that mothers are, because we would love that information.
Yes, the same changes have been found in fathers. So there's less research with fathers, but there's really not much difference. And I think it just comes back to it's the act of caregiving for a child that changes the brain, right? It's not about your gender. And that actually, the work with fathers happened very early because some people thought maybe the brain changes were just a sort of recovery from pregnancy or something happened when you were pregnant. So we have pretty good evidence that the same changes are found in fathers. The same type of parenting largely is effective when fathers do it and mothers do it. There's a couple of differences, but it's pretty much the same.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Joe, and then there was a hand in the very back. So we'll come to you. And I'm going to go way, way in the back, all the way to the stairs. That person back there, you're going to be the third person. So Joe, and then in the back here.
So,
Introduce yourself.
so Joe Jones, Center for Urban Families in Baltimore. Jessica asked the question I actually was going to have, so
Oh, okay.
I'm going to dispense with a question. But I did have an observation based on the last panel and how we treat men and women differently, and that is Raquel, Lynn, Ren, and Shannon were all color coordinated in their dress, and they did not seem to have talked to Daniel in advance about that.
Well, guess what? We didn't color coordinate. So.
They were.
So all the way in the back here, if you'll raise your hand. Yes, great. And introduce yourself, please.
I'm Carol Sale, and I'm with the Williamsburg Health Foundation.
Yes.
Sarah, I had a question for you, and you're talking about the importance of the first 1,000 days, 0 to 3 development, and so forth. I find so many, I want to be careful how I say this, so many parents who think that digital interaction for their children is a great way to develop their brain and keep them active, and so you see infants plop down on the floor with a iPad in front of them, and you see viral videos on Facebook about babies going nuts when you take a phone away from them. And is there any research that you've seen that says pro or con of the idea of digital exposure below the age of 3, and if it makes any difference at all in
Sure.
various economic circumstances?
Yeah, so the American Academy of Pediatrics has some pretty great recommendations around screen usage. So the recommendations are, pretty minimal in the first couple years of life, 30 minutes. Sometimes the recommendations range from 30 minutes to 2 hours a day, but certainly nothing more than that. And the average kid is actually consuming, 4 or 5 hours of screen time a day. The one thing I will say, though, that I think is really interesting, and if you think back, who remembers Sesame Street, when Sesame Street started, Sesame Street was designed to be an intervention. It was an intervention to help kids whose parents had less education get access to the same types of information. And the result of that intervention was actually to increase disparities. The reason the disparities increased is not because some kids watched Sesame Street and some kids didn't. It's that families with more education and more resources watched with their kids.
How they watched.
And talked about what was happening and interacted with them around that. And we're seeing very similar results with iPads and other kinds of media. So the media isn't the evil thing, right? It's what we do with our kids. Sing, talk, play, read, dance, watch something together, right? They live in a digital age. So I think that's how I would sort of summarize that.
Great. Thank you. And all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Judy Berman with DC Appleseed, and I had a question about whether or not the science tells us anything about the competing priorities of child bonding and economic necessity. Because when you went through this, you went through the slides pretty quickly of like, you need $50,000, but you also need bonding time with your child. And I think, most of us who have had children and gone to work have felt that intense pain of separation, in the sense that work has got to be really valuable, either financially or intellectually, to take me away from my child. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything to be learned from that, because I think it's particularly for if we're dealing with families who have not had experience of work, to then just try to build that experience into alongside separation from a child. I'm just wondering if there's anything to be that we can learn from that about how to communicate that and how to deal with it.
Sure. I mean, that's a deeply personal decision, I think, as people try to navigate different things, and probably particularly for families facing low income is where their child is when they're not caring for them, right? So if we don't have a web of support with very high quality educational opportunities, supports for choice for families so that they can have the caregivers that they want, that's a completely separate issue. But let's say that you're able to put your child in a high quality environment. It's quality, not quantity, that matters for attachment. So it's about the quality of the time you spend with your child, not the sheer number of hours. And you can like introspect for a minute and think about, you know, are you that amazing parent on the, you know, 7-day bender on your own? Is it the hours that gets you there, right? It's a lot of it is the quality. It's the quality of the interaction. And one of the things I think though that's really hard is when parents have jobs that are demeaning and unfairly paid. The transition to home can be really hard, and that time is so important for that bonding relationship. The other thing is that the jobs can be very unstable, unpredictable. It's hard for kids to adjust when the routine is, you know, you have to run out the door and you can't sort of transition them. So without putting the burden on parents, which I think really isn't appropriate, right, to be these amazing, sensitive, responsive caregivers in a highly inequitable world, I think we need to talk about what does it take for parents to be able to provide that high quality and high quantity, if that's their choice, caregiving to their kids, and still have economic viability as a family.
Great. Matt, was there anything you wanted to add? Okay. So in the center, yes, right here on the end.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Nigeria Connor, and I'm with Higher Expectations for Racine County. I just really wanted to know if you've seen any difference in brain development for parents with unwanted and unplanned pregnancies versus planned and wanted pregnancies. And then also, has there been any discovery around the trauma of unplanned pregnancy?
That's a great question.
It is a
I'm
great
not
question.
aware of any brain imaging research that compares as a function of, and wantedness and plannedness being two different things. There is quite a bit of research though that unwantedness is a very difficult thing, right? Kids have difficult outcomes when pregnancies are unwanted. Unplanned is complicated, and those two sometimes get merged. Unplanned, it's sort of like, you know, is it unplanned in the sense that you really were hoping for May and it's April, or is it unplanned as in, you know, you're 17 and you were hoping to finish school, right? Those are totally different things. I don't think we have great data on that. There is some new data on wantedness and planned for fathers, and when there is disparity in the wantedness and plannedness between the partners, that can lead to more difficult outcomes. And having your even if it's not the perfect time, having your partner wanting the baby does improve outcomes. So, but I'm not aware of any brain imaging research on that. I don't know if anyone else is.
No. Here, yes.
Hi, I am just wondering, especially thinking about.
Would you mind introducing
Oh,
yourself?
yes, Cynthia Hernandez Cancio Families USA, Center for Health Equity and System Transformation. I'm wondering if, with the information that we have about the difficulties with African American and some other minority women in terms of birth outcomes and the trauma they go through to give birth, whether there's any information about how either what is the impact or how to mediate that impact when it comes to those crucial first months of life, where then you're dealing with potentially a traumatized mom in addition to having to figure out how to raise a kid.
I think it's a really, really important point. I think you could come at that from several different angles. There's the angle of the experience of interface with the healthcare system for women throughout their lives, oftentimes preceding pregnancy, and the degree to which that may feed into, you know, lack of compliance with prenatal care and things like that, where prenatal care may feel like a potentially threatening or difficult or uncomfortable experience at best. And so one angle of getting at that is changing the way that we think about what good prenatal care looks like. Having more prenatal care take place in communities, having access be improved, having behavioral health and addiction be addressed sensitively, confidently, humbly, and capably in the prenatal obstetrical care setting is a really, really important thing where there's a lot of room for growth. It's one of the things we've got some beginning work going on here in DC. I think that's one angle that I think is really promising, but I think you're absolutely right. It reminds me of, this may seem like a strange analogy, but the challenges that many educators face around the idea of family engagement with early education and schools, and the degree to which that difficulty is so informed by mothers and fathers' own experiences being educated, oftentimes in those same schools, and how welcome they and their families felt in schools a generation before, and how much ground we have to cover to change that experience of being welcomed, accepted, and considered to be the expert about your child or the expert about your pregnancy.
I'm going to go all the way in the back here. The gentleman's hands up.
Jim Schuyler with Virginia Community Action. Sarah, I'm thinking about when you would promote resilience and opportunity, and are there times in an adult's life that it is more effective, such as young parents 18 to 24? And is there any research on the time between adversity and when you promote resilience?
I'm torn between answering that with a research answer and a non-research answer. So I'm just going to settle with that for a second. I think that, so there is evidence that pregnancy and the early postnatal period is a fantastic time for intervention. People are able to do things that they are not able to do at other times, like give up highly addictive drugs, like leave abusive relationships, like start some really frightening new training or schooling programs. So interventions that target pregnant and new parents have a lot of possibility. Now, you are targeting somebody whose brain is changing quickly and who has a pretty heavy bandwidth tap on their current situation, right? So my general advice is such intervention should be able to be executed by someone driving a tractor trailer with monkeys crawling on their head. as long as your intervention works under those circumstances, I think it's great, right? Because that's what it feels like to parent, right? Especially with economic pressure. And then the second question, I mean, promoting resilience is, how could there be a bad time to do that? I think there is some really interesting potential in young parents that is as yet unexplored. We are actually imaging some young parents now to look at how the intersection of the brain changes in adolescence and the transition to parenting kind of work together. And that's just a completely unknown at this point. But I think, whenever there's, no wrong door, no wrong time, like resilience is your lived daily experience. Every day that somebody who's experienced unreasonable inequities gets up and walks out the door is an opportunity.
Right, and just one thing to add, which is I think implicit in what Sarah said, is that we shouldn't think about resilience as an intervention. It's a way of thinking about how we ideally build and support systems that allow people to grow up in ways that they thrive, and it's a life course approach. It's generational. It's not. I don't think we're going to have something that we can call resilience intervention that's going to be something that we can drop in.
That's right here on the end.
Hi, thank you. Amandla Anderson, United Way of Central Indiana. I had a question, I think mostly for Randall, but I think all of you could probably provide a little bit of guidance. So a lot of times our human service employees are also those same families that have those incomes that are struggling and trying to thrive. How is there any research around how you continue to support them so that they too are thriving and growing and continuing to stay inspired and motivated in the workforce when they're dealing with some of the same things that their staff, that they're treating clients on day to day?
I don't believe there's a study with it, but I will say that nationwide, I believe that cities have to do better jobs of identifying what a living wage is. And then when you're raising that living wage, they're raising it more on the minimum level, which is understood and okay, but they're not really looking at the degrees of what maybe an individual with a bachelor's degree is getting versus what the minimum wage is raising to. And I think that's a great area of concern, especially when you're mentioning that a lot of the individuals that are providing support to people in need are almost very much in need themselves, and that's a reality. A lot of us are one paycheck away from needing some assistance. So. I don't have a full, complete answer to that, but I know in terms of what we're doing, if there's not something that we can supplement something, then there's always a resource. And exploring resources is something that I've just become like really great at, and just and if I could find something out there that can support, then I will. And more often than not, we do come up with something that can supplement, even if it's on a minimum standard.
Right.
One piece I'd add is that one thing that folks here have been really leading in DC is a bunch of comprehensive legislation around birth to 3, and a core piece of that has been looking at compensation for early childhood educators and making that something that the city should really invest in over the long haul. We're not there yet, but we're continuing to push on it. I'm describing work that other folks are really doing, but it's totally critical, and I think you're exactly right that it's a limiting factor on anything that we want to do in settings that where the ideas are supposed to be helping adults to nurture kids.
Sarah, did you have anything?
I was just going to say, in the same way that it doesn't make sense to turn up in the home and say to a parent, what do you dream for your child? You need to do X, Y, and Z to make a better life for your child. We need to say to parents, what do you need? What didn't you get? Where are you trying to go? I think we need to do the exact same thing to the supportive workforce. Where are you stuck? What do you need?
Yes.
Where are you trying to go? What are your dreams?
Right.
Instead of trying to motivate people to do these enormously difficult tasks just with this fear and need and no attention to their own journey.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to Aisha, and then Amber.
Thank you. Aisha Yandoro, Springboard to Opportunities. This question is specifically for Sarah. Sarah, with your research, have you noticed that the brain continues to develop and grow with subsequent kids, or do you tap out after a certain number?
Great question.
Yeah. So we don't know the answer to that question yet. I'm sorry. There is ongoing research, though. The research to date has been restricted to first-time parents, but there's projects in progress that have parents at different places in the journey. But as long as you raised your hand, it reminded me to say that the same people who had the project with the $50,000 and the linear brain growth are trying cash transfer. Those are the same people who've done right? They've done cash transfers forever. Aisha's organization is doing cash transfers, and people are looking to see whether those cash transfers result in brain growth, which would really cut to the chase, because programming is expensive. Maybe it would make more sense, like Springboard's doing, like Lyft does, to give people money.
Great. And the last question goes to Amber.
Thank you. Amber Angel with Los Angeles Valley College Family Resource Center. And my question, I think, is also for Randall. You talked about serving 200 to 300 families a day, which is a really large number. That's big scale. And data collection for all of us is kind of an issue. So I'm thinking about, and with funding coming out and trying to create programs, how are you tracking the outcomes and the data of these families?
That's a great question.
Particularly, you mentioned Diaper Bank, which is huge at our something we're really doing at the college to support students who are raising children. And then are you tracking just children outcomes? Or are you tracking parent outcomes? Are they enrolling in school? How are you doing that?
I believe, and Matt, you can definitely chime in. I believe we're currently checking, tracking or looking at the outcomes of the household, beginning with, of course, the child. The way that we're doing this, the information is going into the medical record in a extractable way, but of course, all of the data cannot be extracted. Is confidentially, so to say, labeled to specific areas. The information that we are extracting, though, is giving us good outcomes in terms of the child's development from where we are now. We don't have any data that can really go back, much, to the past. We kind of are working in the present. And then I believe they're using that information to kind of collaboratively compare to the national model, which is operative in over 20 odd states, and then just comparing that information on a from a research or from an analytical standpoint. But
it's a great question. We have a lot of growth. It's a new program. Thanks to Randall and his colleagues, it's grown really fast. There's about 1,000 kids a year who are getting direct services from the Healthy Steps team. And we're looking at process data and also specific pilot data. For example, the year before Randall started at the clinic that he works, when kids, we talked about autism before, kids were identified as at risk for autism and referred from the pediatrician to early intervention for an evaluation, less than 20% of kids completed an evaluation. Since Randall started, the number is now at about 80%. Are completing an evaluation.
Wow, that's great. That's great.
And that's just like using human talent and sweat to connect with families and like Randall said, inherit their problems, invest in them, and make sure they get to where they need to go and where they want to go, despite many of the barriers that exist. So we're looking at a lot of process measures like that, also connecting parents to their own behavioral health care, ideally in the same clinic, but also in other sites as well, if parents prefer. What we want to move toward is more of a population health data strategy where we can look at 2-generation outcomes over time, but we're not there yet. It's a great question.
Thank you. Really great question to end on.